Hello there. Welcome to my review of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, Series 1, Episode 3, The Golden Pince-Nez. This is the only episode of the series not to feature Dr. Watson due to a scheduling issue with Edward Hardwicke. It was the first episode filmed and the contracts weren't settled by the time production was due to start, so Hardwicke was unavailable due to filming Shadowlands. As a result, the episode was quickly rewritten to incorporate Mycroft, and Charles Gray was brought in. So, how does that affect the episode? Let's find out. The episode begins with scenes of revolution, as the Russian army subdue an uprising. We see a woman desperately searching through documents before literally being crushed underfoot by a Russian soldier. We then cut to Baker Street and see Holmes through a window. Inside, Inspector Hopkins enters and the scene continues from this unusual angle, as if to suggest that without Watson, not just the dynamic but also the perspective of the story has shifted. After some expository dialogue explaining Watson's absence and a joke at Sherlock's expense,
Watson's only cure for any ailment is a Linus powder and a grated apple.
You know, you only say that because you miss the doctor.
Hopkins, played by Nigel Planer, explains why he has engaged Sherlock, in thorough detail.
I've drawn up a rough plan. The various points of the case which seem to me to be essential. No footmarks were to be found on the path, but someone had passed along the grass border which lines it.
You found footmarks there?
Not exactly, but the grass was trodden down. Rain had only begun during the night.
He's confounded by a murder. Willoughby Smith, the secretary for invalid Professor Coram, played by the wonderful Frank Finlay, who I was lucky enough to meet shortly before he died.
Then perforce one must also re-evaluate Christian theology.
Smith was found by the maid, Susan Tarleton, having been stabbed in the neck with a letter opener. His last words to her being,
"Professor, it was she."
And Smith had clutched in his hands a pair of golden pince-nez, with a very strong prescription that the Holmes boys deduce belonged to a woman, with a
Puckered forehead, peering expression,
with rounded shoulders. This is the first obvious concession to an absent Watson, as in the original story it is Holmes alone that makes this deduction, and we can see how the writers accomplished this necessary change by sharing Sherlock's dialogue and actions between the two brothers. It means that Mycroft doesn't suddenly have to become the clueless one, as they've already established he is the cleverer but lazier brother. And by including Hopkins in more of the story, he then fulfills the Watson role as audience surrogate and question asker.
I think you know as much as I do. Perhaps more.
It's a brilliant way of solving the problem, and while it wouldn't sustain for very long, it's perfectly fine for this one episode. There's also a beautiful shot of Sherlock as he's examining the pince-nez, creating a sort of mask that highlights his eyes. It's not often TV shows have the time to construct shots like this, even rarer nowadays, so it's very welcome. The three men make their way to Yoxley Old Place, the scene of the crime, with Hopkins explaining that nothing seems to have been taken and there is no motive for the crime. As they make their way to the house, we see a schoolmistress drop her own pince-nez in among some children at play. Suggestive at the very least. At Professor Coram's house, Sherlock finds that the lock of the bureau where the murder was committed is scratched, and is also severely irked to discover that their father gave his magnifying glass to Mycroft rather than Sherlock.
He gave it to you?
Sherlock interviews the household, no one having seen or heard the intruder, with the chain-smoking professor claiming that Smith may have killed himself.
suicide.
Young men have their hidden troubles, Mr. Holmes.
Mycroft has already had enough of the investigation and plans to return to London with some famous parting words for Sherlock and a gift of his snuff box.
Eliminate the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
His plans to leave, however, have been scuppered by a lack of trains, but he does discover a suffragette meeting that relates to a clue he had discovered in Smith's diary earlier.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your sensitivity.
This is a new, prescient addition to the original story, as it was set in 1904, as the suffrage movement was just beginning to gain some ground. In the context of the mystery, the organiser is Abigail Crosby, who Smith was courting, and she is also the pince-nez-wearing schoolmistress we saw earlier. Hopkins and Mycroft's view of women's suffrage is reflective of Conan Doyle's own views on the subject, as he saw the acts of terrorism and potential for it to lead to socialist governments being elected. However, just 3 years later, he had changed his views on the issue, becoming a supporter of the Votes for Women movement. Hopkins spots the maid at this meeting and, viewing all suffragists as criminals, brings her in for questioning, where she reveals that Smith and Crosby were courting until he revealed his true feelings about the suffrage movement. This is enough for Hopkins to arrest Crosby. However, by this time, Sherlock has discovered the clue Mycroft left for him in his parting gift, and with a second visit to the professor, he is able to confirm his theory.
Snuff.
The murderer is a woman who let herself into the professor's home with keys to the bureau, but was caught by Smith, so fled. Confused by the layout of the house, instead of finding the back door, she was forced to enter the professor's bedroom. He has kept her hidden ever since, as she is his estranged wife. She emerges from her hiding place and explains that Professor is actually a Russian revolutionary who gave up his comrades, including her and her brother, to save himself, and then fled to Britain. She was searching for papers that she knew could prove her brother's innocence and did not mean to kill Smith. Unable to face the consequences of her actions, she has ingested poison and dies shortly after explaining what had happened. In a final act of divine justice, Professor Karam is murdered by a Russian dissident who has been keeping watch on the house for the last few days. This episode has an intriguing mystery at its heart, and the substitution of Mycroft for Watson is done pretty flawlessly. The addition of the suffragette subplot doesn't feel out of place, although is perhaps introduced and dismantled too late and too quickly to be of any real significance. Where it falls down, in a similar fashion to The Three Gables, is in the conclusion, which features a lot of exposition, some unnecessary, from a character we've only just met. I feel like, in order to keep the scene a little more interesting, there was an opportunity to share all of Anna, Karam's wife's dialogue between her, Mycroft, Sherlock and Karam, just to keep it a little more fresh, either asking questions, filling in what they knew or what they had deduced. Even with the flashback shots of the Russian uprising, it didn't hold my interest as much as it should have. For that reason, this is a 3 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.